What is up, everybody, and welcome to yet another Legion live developer Q&A. My name is always Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, joined once again by Game Director Ion Hazzikostas. Ian, thanks so much for being here once again.
Anytime. It's always a pleasure.
Awesome. So we do have a lot of questions to get through today, and we're just going to dive right into them. First one comes from Azavara, who asked, any updates on the plans for artifact appearances post-Legion?
Nothing really new or has changed, I think, since we spoke about this last, but for those who may not have heard those last time we outlined them, the general thought is that after the Legion expansion is done and players aren't necessarily using their artifacts anymore, we want to unlock any appearances that you've earned for your artifact as transmog looks that you can apply going forward when you're on that class. The only exceptions for those will be the sort of more challenging appearances, so specifically the Mage Tower unlocks and the Mythic 15 unlock. Those appearances will be available as transmogs if you've earned them, but you won't be able to earn the appearances once Legion is done. Kind of similar to how we treated challenge mode weapons and armor back in the past. So if you want those, get them done now, but otherwise, don't worry about it. If you love the look of your Ashbringer, you'll be able to keep that look going forward. And if you're playing a new character down the line, you'll be able to go back and earn any appearances except for those skill-requiring ones at your own leisure.
And just to clarify, I believe we've said before as well that one of the ones that you will be able to go back and get is actually the one from Balance of Power, right?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure everyone got that message as well. Similar question here from We Are Legion on Twitter asking, will we still be able to use the new Druid forms, such as the Baron Cat, from the artifact weapon after Legion?
Yes, I mean, we essentially view those looks as the weapon appearance when you're in form, because that's where you're spending most of your time as a Feral or Guardian.
Cool. So we'll find some way to make sure that you can still use those after Legion. Okay, question here from Zyra, who asked, how will upgrading our legendaries to 1,000 work when the raid releases?
So the current thinking is to do it pretty much the same way the upgrades to 940 and 970 worked, where there's a repeatable quest and items that are widely available from all sorts of activities. I think at this point we've ironed out a lot of the kinks in the system in terms of not clearing your overflow of the currency when you turn it in, things like that. Especially in the last round, we also made it available from a much wider variety of sources, including everything from heroic dungeons to world bosses and more. So in general, players should be able to very quickly upgrade the 2 or 3 legendaries that they use the most and feel like they're at full capability there, and then round out the rest of their collection over time. I understand, especially if you have lots and lots of legendaries, this may feel almost pointless, and to some extent, I think it's a product of value. We don't like changing items out from under people. There's something odd about logging in and just having this item automatically become more powerful. So that's why new ones that are obtained after Antorus unlocks will just drop at 1,000, but there's this extra set of steps that you go through for the old ones. I mean, that said, even unupgraded, the old ones are still more powerful than virtually anything else you're likely to be wearing at that point. So they're still very strong items in their own right. It's just something to work towards over time.
Okay, cool. Next question comes from Silent Hit. Another question about legendaries asking, will legendaries become more available in 7.3.5 or in the future of Legion?
Well, 7.3.5 isn't something, I mean, that's not a patch that we've really announced or talked about at all yet. There's 7.3.2 on the PTR right now that's more of kind of an infrastructure patch on our end that has some bug fixes and support for Antorus in it. We're definitely keeping an eye on legendary drop rates. I think that's something there's room to continue increasing, especially for those first few. Completely understand that if you're making a new character, switching mains, things along those lines, and don't yet have legendaries at all, getting those first few feels essential to be competitive and relevant at this point in the game. That's something that we are likely to increase. We're also just looking at the system as a whole and how that works as we continue deeper into Legion. Players may have noticed that there are legendary tokens that are available that seemingly create a legendary for a specific class. Those have been data mined on PTR. So just to clarify how those are going to be used, those are actually, and this may come as a disappointment to some, but those are actually what you'll earn if you literally have all legendaries for your class.
Oh, okay.
So if you have every legendary for your class, so initially we made it so that if you have all of them for your spec, you'll get them for other specs.
Yeah.
If you have them for your entire class, then you can get these tokens that may let you help out your alts and get them up to speed a bit faster. It's a little bit of catch up on our part, but also makes it feel constructive just to keep earning those rewards as you're continuing to play in your main if you want to do that. Now, that said, these tokens definitely are something that could see a different purpose further on down the line in the expansion. We know there's a lot of desire to have a bit more control over legendary acquisition, and the fact that they exist gives us a vehicle to do that. But at this point, we're not adding lots of new legendaries to the drop tables. In fact, we're not adding any new legendaries to the drop tables. So we're still seeing players, on average, having a reasonable number of them, and we've done a lot to balance and shrink the power discrepancies between the legendaries that are out there.
Okay, yeah, I think I know, especially I've seen a lot of people. It's obviously a relatively small number of people that have collected all legendaries for their class, but I have seen a lot of concerns from those players that they're saying, well, what happens now? Do I just not get any more legendaries?
Exactly.
Do I start earning legendaries again?
Yeah.
So having that there will be pretty
for
cool.
some people that may seem like a very first world problem, but it's more future proofing to some extent. It's a very small number now, but because, like I said, we're not adding new legendaries over the coming months, there will be more and more people who end up in that boat.
Cool. Next question from Aludai, who said, any plans for balancing underperforming specs before Antorus?
Probably not. I think at this point we've taken a few rounds of balancing in 7.3. In the post-Nithrolite Crucible era, we've done some adjustments to account for different weapon scaling and just looking at performance in Tomb. The gaps there are smaller than they have been in the past. We're seeing pretty good representation at all levels of content. Obviously, there are some specs that are more popular than others, but we're seeing people succeeding with all specs. Now, that's not to say we think the game is perfectly balanced per se, but balance is always relative. I think that if we were to balance around Tomb right now, that wouldn't necessarily have much effect at all on the meters as they would play out in Antorus, where we have a number of different fights with different damage profiles, new set bonuses coming into play, new trinkets coming into play, and just a different mix than we have in Tomb. So I think we're certainly going to do balance passes shortly after Antorus unlocks, but that will be based on that data and be designed to create, a balanced environment in the next tier of content.
Yeah, it makes sense, and that's a theme that we've seen so many times and over so many raid tiers in the past, where I used to love doing this back before I was at Blizzard when I was just doing like YouTube and live streaming and stuff, and I would say, okay, here's what the numbers are right now. They will not be this in a week once the raid is out. It's going to be completely and totally different. Just because fights are different, you end up with different mechanics you have to deal with. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I honestly, like, if I were thinking from a player's perspective, if I were to choose between, let's have the class team spend a whole bunch of time balancing before the raid is out, and let's have the class team spend a whole bunch of time balancing a week after the raid is out, I'd much rather have them look at what that live data is like.
And I think, again, it's all about a matter of degree. If there were huge gaps in performance, then we would have addressed those, and in fact, we did. At this point, though, the margin of error and the variance that we're seeing in Tomb isn't large enough to be deeply concerning, and in fact, it feels like something that is more a product of Tomb in particular rather than specific specs that are overall too strong or others that are overall too weak. And changes that we have planned to things like set bonuses or specific trinkets will also have some effect there.
Okay.
We want to see how those play out.
Excellent. Question here from Hambrick, very much along the lines of what you were just saying. Are there any plans to reduce the viability of old set bonuses? Having 6 slots locked behind tier feels really bad.
We agree. So we definitely have adjusted some tier 19 bonuses. Certainly, any tier 19 bonuses that we're looking to likely candidates to continue being used going all the way into tier 21, that felt like a step too far. Now, of course, that may still be the case that people move from where they are now to using 4-piece tier 21 and 2-piece tier 20.
Yeah.
That's an area where we're just honestly not super happy with how the set piece system and class set system is playing out. We added a 6th slot for more flexibility, but also to acknowledge and to make room for the legendary system, right? The old set system with 5 pieces would have been problematic if you had 2 legendaries that you really wanted to use in your main set slots. That just would have been incompatible. You wanted to make sure that you could use, let's say, legendary pants and a helm and still complete your set bonus if you wanted to. Where that's left us, though, is a place where on the other end of the spectrum, there are many people who are using a 4-piece bonus, a 2-piece bonus, and 2 other legendaries, which means that nearly half of the character item slots that you have are effectively dead slots. Whether you're opening your mythic chest at the end of the week or you're getting any non-set items, anything that's in those slots is automatically off the table, and that feels pretty bad.
Yeah.
And that's something that will definitely inform our design, I think, in the future. Right now, we weren't really able to come up with a satisfying way of stopping people from using 4-piece and 2-piece or mixing and matching sets. Certainly, like 2-piece and 2-piece as you're on your way towards completing them has always been something the players have done, and feels like something you should be able to do. So, trying to come up with something that felt intuitive and wasn't overly restrictive has been a challenge.
Yeah, like if I've equipped these 2 pieces of gear, and so I get this bonus. Unless I equip those 4 pieces of gear, then that bonus disables. That seems really weird and arbitrary.
And somehow making it clear through tooltips or otherwise that that's how it's going to work.
Yeah.
And so we're working on it. We agree with the concern.
Okay, cool. Similar question here about tier sets coming from Hummus, who asked, what is the philosophy behind certain tier sets forcing a very specific play style? For example, Havoc tier 20 and tier 21. And will we see changes towards more quote-unquote neutral bonuses, for example, Havoc tier 19, going forward? So we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, and I think the question, just to clarify for everyone, because I was a little bit confused about this, I'm not super familiar with Havoc myself, especially the set bonuses. It's talking about, do you have set bonuses that sort of push you towards specific like talent choices, ability usage, or do you have set bonuses that are just kind of like all-around improvements?
So I think in general, we've tried to land somewhere in the middle. The first sets of a given tier tend to be a bit on the simpler side, and certainly for a brand new class like Demon Hunter, while people were still figuring out and exploring the way to play the class, we were very conservative with how those set bonuses played out. We did a similar thing way back in like Wrath of the Lich King with the first Death Knight sets, for example. That said, I think we've generally tried to have sets that vary your gameplay a little bit, that aren't just purely passive modifiers that make you feel like there's a small tweak to your rotation or some proc that you're taking into account, something along those lines. We agree that it's probably going too far where having a set practically mandates an entire build. Like it dictates using these couple of talents or this legendary and using this ability instead of that one and shifting your rotation accordingly. That's a bit too large a change, especially because it's not it feels like it's almost locking you into that and removing choice.
Right.
And you may be stuck with that for 5 to 7 months, depending on how early you get the set and what we're talking about. So I think we'd like to pull away from that level of extreme change going forward, but also don't want them to be totally passive.
Okay. That makes sense to me. Next question here from Vivek asking, with the success of MDI, how do you see the team expanding on Mythic Plus? What do you think of having seasons every tier, like how WoW Progress tracks players?
Mythic Dungeons, pretty sexy. So I think, it was awesome seeing the MDI unfold over the last few weeks, and it was just tremendously exciting. We didn't entirely know what to expect going into it, and came out of it as excited as everybody else who was watching.
Yeah, definitely.
We're really happy with Mythic Dungeons. Mythic Keystone system on the live servers is something we're going to continue to expand for sure. We already effectively do have these little mini seasons where, whether it's bump up dungeons across the board, reset the rewards, renormalize things. And so that's something we're going to continue doing. In terms of tracking, I mean, we have, the weekly leaderboards that are on our website. That's what fan sites harvest for that information. Something we'd like to look at formalizing more, but I would definitely expect to see us do more in this space in the future.
Yeah, just watching even just the response to the Mythic Dungeon Invitational, it's clear that this is something that players are really excited about as well as us. So it's really kind of like, now we're just sort of looking at it like, okay, cool, this is great. What can we do with it from here? That's kind of awesome. In fact, here's a good example of that from Netherial, who asked, has the Mythic Dungeon Invitational given the team more insight on what classes need help with defensives and or utility?
It's definitely been insightful in that regard, and I think I would also hope that it also opens some eyes in the community about some of the different approaches that are available, some of the different things that classes and specs can bring to the table that may not have been as commonly considered when planning your pickup groups or doing dungeons with your friends. I think it was awesome to see things like Shroud of Concealment from Rogues, which was an ability that came back in 7.1 as a core part of the utility that they brought.
Yeah.
Or tactical use of Warlock and Slave Demon in a couple of specific dungeons, or Protection Warrior having the trump card against Shade of Medivh just through Spell Reflect, and little things like that here and there. Really, what we'd like to do is give more classes those sorts of things. Obviously, there's some broad categories like immunities, which are something that we're always discussing. They're probably actually in many cases a bit too widespread now. That's more of a raid issue than a dungeon issue in some ways. There's battle res and the role that played in determining group compositions in Mythic Dungeons. That's something that we're also talking about in terms of encouraging more class and spec diversity. But really, I think it would be great if there were a world where almost everybody had situations where they shined, things that they could bring to the table that opened up tactical and strategic options because you had an X in your group instead of a Y. Now, again, that's not to say, the so-called bring the class, not the player, but rather you will approach a dungeon differently depending on what you do have, and you'll value the classes for the unique things they're bringing. I think that's a better place for us to go than trying to copy the things that some classes have and give them to others. The second we do that, it now turns into, well, who has a better version of this?
Yeah.
Okay, we want the person who has the best version, and then the other class, instead of feeling cool for having that bit of utility, they feel like, well, I just have a second-rate version of what that guy over there has, and now no one feels good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also really cool seeing, just from a player's perspective, seeing these things. You were talking a little bit earlier about Shroud of Concealment and stuff like that being used in the Mythic Dungeon Invitational. And that's the sort of thing that if you run with an organized group all the time, that you kind of, I think, end up taking for granted. But then as soon as you go and run with the pickup group, or you find someone through the group finder, and they haven't experienced that before, they don't expect it. The example that comes to mind for me is the second, I believe it's the second boss in Blackrook Hold. The Demon Hunter boss there, I forget her name at this exact moment. Ilisana, yes, exactly. When her ads come out, you can, as a Mistweaver, I can paralyze one of them that jumps out, and then they just sort of stand there, and you can finish the fight and ignore them. And that's great when I'm playing with my friends, because I can say, hey, I'm going to paralyze this one, don't worry about it. But when I'm playing with a pickup group, immediately someone runs over and breaks it. And so it's cool having the Mythic Dungeon Invitational sort of as a way for people to see, like, oh, this is what those organized groups are actually doing. So I just wanted to mention that I'm really excited about the Mythic Dungeon Invitational for that sort of thing, not only for educating us on what players are doing, but also educating other players on what other players are doing. It's really cool. All right, moving on. Question from Valark, who asked, can we expect better mission rewards after followers are 950? Current rewards don't seem commensurate with the increased resource cost encounters required. Is the new max level merely for access to Antorus raid missions? And I believe we actually put out a hotfix late yesterday that helps with this. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Pretty much. I mean, I think it's more or less what was documented in the hotfix. Yes, when the Antorus raid missions become available, you'll need those maxed out followers to tackle those. But we also wanted to make sure that the higher level missions felt more consistently rewarding.
Yeah.
And so bumped the rewards further there, and that's something we'll continue to look at. But obviously, we never wanted to feel like you made a mistake by completing a quest or progressing through the system.
Yeah, I think if you really dug into the numbers, it worked out that it was still more lucrative overall. It can easily, when you get to that point and you see that mission that looks less enticing than the one that you just had before, I totally see how that's not a great feeling. Question here from Airnath, really short and to the point. Can you make Argus Whistle upgrade account wide?
Yep. That's actually, thank you very much for the question. That's one of those, I saw the question come in on Twitter and thought to myself, that's a really good point. That should be that way. There's no reason why you should have to do Argusian multiple times on multiple characters. We're working on changing that now. So I would look for a hotfix within the next day or two that makes it so that if you've used the whistle, unlocked the whistle upgrade on one character, all of your characters have that functionality in Argus.
Awesome. So there you go. Everyone, please thank Airnath for getting that change made for you. Question here from Garasar, who asked, how do you feel about PvP seasons being synced with patches? Is this going to continue to be the norm or just coincidence?
I don't know that it's the norm. It'll happen sometimes. It won't happen other times. I think there's two main questions when it comes to PvP season start and end. First is PvP seasons are likely going to be linked to the opening of new raid zones, to the availability of new rewards. We want to keep our game systems in sync there. So when the dungeon eye level gets bumped up and the new raid opens up, we also want a new PvP season with comparable rewards to keep the game balanced in that regard. Now, when it comes to ending seasons, sometimes if we have a patch that has a significant amount of class change in it, we're hesitant to have the last couple of weeks of an existing season get played out under a completely different set of rules or balance than most of the rest of the season was played in.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty unfair to people who worked hard to earn rating, or, a season has played out in a certain way, and suddenly the whole metagame might shift right at the end. Doesn't feel right. That said, increasingly in WoW, I think we're getting away from patches necessarily being tied to new types of content. I think we see the patch as a precondition. Like, we have to get the data onto your computers. We have to get the infrastructure in place to make the content available, whether it's a raid, whether it's a new PvP season, whether it's a special event. But the timing for those things should be more determined by what is the right time for players. Has the season been dragging on for too long? Is it time for something to freshen it up? Or are players ready for a new raid? Are players ready for this event? Rather than everything always having to come together. So I guess in short, sometimes it'll be that way, but it doesn't always have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, if I remember correctly, the Legion Season 2 started separately from a patch.
Yeah.
And I don't believe the next season starts with 7.3.2 also, because that's just kind of a small little...
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
We view 7.3.2 as it's not a major class balance patch. There's no reason to, or PvP balance patch, there's no reason that the season has to end right when that patch drops.
Okay, cool. Next question from Faralea, I believe is how that's pronounced, who asked, will world quests be account-wide in Crocune and Macquarie?
So at this point, we've been trying to make virtually everything that we can account-wide, including the flight whistle just recently on Argus. Crocune and Macquarie world quests are basically the one exception to that. Those world quests overlap with the one-time story quests that take place in the same locations, and often there'd be a lot of conflicts that could happen if you were on both of those at the same time, whether it's phasing, whether it's objectives, whether it's what spawns are around. And you do need to rescue Zira from the crashed Zenidar before you can do the world quests in that exact same space outside the crashed Zenidar, and that's just a restriction of how our quests are built, unfortunately. Everything else, including in Torn Wastes, for example, where there are no story quests in the same vein, we're able to open in Torn Wastes world quests for everyone right away. So in general, though, a character showing up in Argus for the first time at this point should see the vast majority of things available for them. They can, do the Crucible, they can go do invasion points, they can go to Torn Wastes, they can earn their currencies, unlock those rewards, travel around to all the teleportation nodes. And if the main thing that you're looking for on your alts is, artifact power, reputation, Veiled Argonite, well, the story quests actually give those fairly generously. So doing those story quests, while potentially repetitive if you're doing it for the sixth or seventh time or whatever, should still be one of the most efficient ways of earning those rewards.
Okay, cool. So yeah, it sounds like there's some sort of technical restriction that's preventing us from really being able to do that, but maybe something that we would have wanted to do if it wasn't for that restriction.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Jen Rainbow 81 asked, will the artifact knowledge cap be going up again, and if so, when?
At this point, it's going up every week, essentially, in 7.3, right? Every Tuesday in North America, every Wednesday in Europe, every Thursday in Asia. When you log in, your knowledge is one higher, and that's, we think a more streamlined system than the manual research that we had for so much of the rest of the expansion. That will continue until knowledge 55. 55 knowledge should be really more than enough to get to 75 points in your artifact, which will fully unlock the Crucible traits. And at this point, we don't anticipate a need to raise the knowledge cap beyond that, and don't really have any plans to do so.
Cool. 55 knowledge. Like it's already at the. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to like math that through in my head. It's already at the point where
It's
when you
big
get
numbers.
you get a new character right to 110, and then immediately like entire artifact. It's really funny.
It's one of those things. It's admittedly a little awkward, right? It's like, yep. It's the whole. You look at numbers in the billions, and it's not the most elegant thing in the world, to say the least. But the flip side is catch up is essential, right? And it's more important to have an alt be able to hit max level and be relevant quickly than to keep the numbers sane and smooth.
Yeah. All right, next question. I love this question from Gradia because it sort of reads like, if you're watching like the History Channel and they have one of those like Civil War documentaries and they're reading like the letter that like one of the soldiers sent back to their loved ones back home.
I can see that.
It was like, "Dearest Ian, I'm curious if whether or not the Spider World boss in Suramar will ever come back. As of writing this, it has been up only once since launch, and I really need rank 3 prolonged power recipe. Yours as ever, Gradient."
Okay, so
I take everything very seriously, as you can tell.
Always. That was actually fantastic. So Nazak the Fiend should be back again. Part of this, we changed the world boss rotation to be fixed as opposed to random, which should place that boss back in the rotation. That said, and this is, I know, small consolation to people who don't have rank 3 prolonged power and wish they did, there's actually something kind of cool about that. I actually wish we could capture more of that with professions sometimes, where, and clearly, if you don't want some people to be able to do everything and others can do nothing, because, well, then you just feel bad. But the sense of there are some things that are in demand that are more limited in their availability, and there are some recipes that some people can make more efficiently than others, or some things that some can make and others can't. As long as there's asymmetry there, that's in many ways, I think, a more interesting place for the economy to be and for professions to be than everyone can make everything with equal optimal efficiency. You think way back to the old days of who has the Arcanet Reaper plans and who has Felsteel Reaper plans and things like that, and just having them to some extent gave you this economic power, and because you wanted the things produced by it, that led to more of that player and player interaction versus everybody being self-sufficient and just mailing stuff from their herbalist alt to their alchemist main or vice versa to craft things for themselves. So that said, random world boss, probably not the best way of accomplishing that.
Sure.
So Nazak will be back around, and then everyone can at long last get their prolonged power recipe, and everyone will be equal.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's a really good point, though. Like, I think if that sort of thing was more common, where it was more regular that I have these cool recipes, I don't have those cool recipes, but I do have these ones. So then you could be like, all right, well, who's in my guild that can make rank 3 prolonged power, and who's in my guild that can make like rank 3 mana potions or something like that? That could actually be pretty cool. It actually really was back in like the TBC and the classic days. A question here from Ahira LS on Twitter, who says, if world bosses are to stay at their current item level well below World Quest, could we get them all up weekly instead of randomly?
At this point, I think we view those almost as content that the rest of the game has passed by. And it's the reason why we haven't updated their item level is the same reason we haven't updated the item level of Emerald Nightmare. It's those world bosses were there a year ago, and they were meant to accompany the raid content of a year ago and provide that rotating weekly reward. And I think it's totally fine that players don't feel as motivated to go back and do them every week, and that they're not rewarding to go back and do every week. It's no different than, in Mists of Pandaria, you probably didn't go back and do Shaw of Anger every single week. Later on in the expansion, there were new world bosses. You were going to Isle of Thunder, you were going to Timeless Isle for the better rewards. So similarly, it's right now it's the greater invasion points on Argus and the Nether Disruptor world bosses on Broken Shore. Once Taurus opens up, a lot of people will probably look at the Broken Shore world bosses as also a bit outdated, and that's fine.
Yeah, I like the comparison to raids as well. You were saying they were meant to sort of complement the raid content of the time, and like the gear in Emerald Nightmare is kind of way behind at this point as
Exactly.
well. It's not something that you're going to go back and do Emerald Nightmare every week. You shouldn't necessarily feel like you should also be going back and doing the old world bosses.
And that's how we
week.
think of it. I mean, Brutalis and all the other Broken Shore world bosses, they're equal to normal Tomb of Sargeras loot.
Right.
The Antorus Greater Invasion Point bosses are equal to normal Antorus loot. And so that's effectively how the content is structured.
Yeah. The other side of this is the one that we were talking about in the previous question, though, which is actually getting the rare drops off of those specific world bosses, which we made the change in 7.3 so that they're on a fixed rotation.
Right.
So
Whether it's,
they should come up at some point.
Whether it's your artifact appearance or that desperate hunt for the Arcana Crystal, there's still some reasons to go after specific ones.
Excellent. Question here from Squibs, who asked, will we see any development with the Sylvanas and Greymane storyline?
Of course. So yeah, this is something that certainly was amply set up in the events leading into Legion and touched on a little bit over the course of the Zone of Stormheim. And that's not a plot thread that we're beginning just to forget about. But at the end of the day, we have a lot of characters in the world of Azeroth, and we tend to focus on a subset of them to have more accessible storylines for any given moment in time, and then return to the others as it makes sense. The last couple of patches in Legion have really focused on united efforts against the Legion. And yes, there's deep tensions between the Alliance and the Horde, and Sylvanas and Greymane certainly haven't forgotten about that. But that's not the focus of the story right now. The focus of the story is the class orders banding together to assault the Tomb of Sargeras and the Broken Shore. It's the Army of the Light and Velen and Illidan and Khadgar working together to launch this assault on Argus to save our world. But we'll be back to Sylvanas and Greymane for sure.
Excellent, yeah. And that's kind of the nature of stories being told in chapters as well. Like if you think of a major TV series like Game of Thrones or something, like sometimes you need Daenerys to just sort of chill for a while you tell everybody else's story, and then you can go back later and be like, okay, this is what she's up to.
Pretty much.
It's kind of the same thing going on here. Cool. Question here from Skewy, who asked, you guys said that the Broken Shore buildings will at one point be ever present. What about that? I don't. So
I'm not. Yeah, I don't 100% remember saying that, but someone may have at some point.
I think it was something. If I'm remembering what this what Skewy is talking about here, I think at one point in one of the earlier Q&As about 7.2, we said when someone asked what's going to happen with the Broken Shore buildings once people stop doing Broken Shore, we said maybe we will get to a point where we need to make them ever present. I don't think we said that was the plan, because it hasn't been like a set hard like eventually we'll do that sort of plan.
Ultimately, I mean, I think at this point we've adjusted the rate at which they are rebuilt, the contributions required. So I think we're back to roughly the same rotation that we were seeing at the peak of activity in Broken Shore, because we reduced the number of supplies required to build them. There's still systems tied into them. There's still reputation tied into it. There are achievements. It's part of the backbone of that content, and it's something that I think will likely make sense to continue in that form. Yes, obviously the story has advanced, and we've fought the Legion and defeated them in Tomb of Sargeras, but, well, I mean, that's no different from content throughout the rest of the expansion. We ultimately are telling a sequential story throughout these areas. Same way, if you go back to Icecrown right now, there's still Argent Tournament jousting, getting ready to fight the Lich King, because that's what was going on then. We don't know that we gain a lot by ripping that content out on a regular basis, just to serve a story that people are leaving behind anyway. Yeah,
I actually kind of mentally compare this to Hala in old Nagrand in Nagrand. I always say both of those names wrong, Hala and Nagrand. Anyway, I think back to like when Burning Crusade was still fresh content, it took like a team of 40 people to actually take over Hala and get in there, and then you could go in and buy the items off the vendors and stuff. Nowadays, one, maybe two people can do it pretty easily on their own. And that's the sort of thing that it sounds like is what we're sort of keeping an eye on with the Broken Shore, if it does need to eventually get to that point.
Right. Certainly, we would want to make sure the content always feels functional.
Sure.
We know we'll need to change something in later expansions. I mean, if it literally takes months to build a single building and it never happens, that's not a system we'd keep around, even for people who are going back as completionists trying to get achievements. But we're very far from that right now.
Cool. Moving on. Next question for I can't say this. Corrupcija? I apologize. I've absolutely butchered that name. Why does the last boss on Mythic difficulty only drop one mount and not two like in Mists of Pandaria? It's hard to farm them for everyone in the raid group since new raids come so often.
So I think the specific case in Mists, there we had separate 10 and 25 player difficulties that were purporting to offer equal loot, equal challenge, equal rewards. And so there was one mount for a 10-player group. We needed to have more for the 25-player group for it to feel remotely fair. With a single raid difficulty, we've reverted to the way these mounts have worked for a long time. When you killed 25-player heroic Lich King back in the day, you got one invincible.
Yep.
Now we're mindful of that long-term burden if you're a guild trying to go back and farm all of these, which also informs our decision to not always include one in every single tier. That's part of why Kil'jaeden Entomb doesn't have one of these. So you're not layering and stacking more and more and more things that you need to get for your guild if you're fortunate enough and skilled enough to be in a mythic guild that's clearing the current content.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Next question from Artunius DPS. I know you're looking forward to this one. He says, why is there so much RNG in Legion? I understand RNG is a core concept of the game, but Legion blows the roof off of it.
So this is a broad question, probably broad, hopefully not too rambling answer.
Okay.
So randomness, I think, is something that's always been at the core of World of Warcraft, as the question correctly states.
Yeah.
It's in fact been at the core of basically any RPG system across genres, going back to rolling dice in pen and paper games. And part of that is, it's variability of outcome, variability of reward. There's excitement and unpredictability. But of course, it needs to be very carefully managed. And random outcomes that seem like they're binary and determine success or failure, where you feel like you won or lost or are strong or weak based purely on the flip of a coin or the roll of a die, well, that's very unsatisfying. I think philosophically, the way randomness has expressed itself in Legion can probably be summed up as it's in more places, but we've tried to make those individual random choices have less impact on average, so that it'll average out across the entirety of the game. Looking at loot, for example. Years ago, we were much stingier with loot. There weren't nearly as many sources of viable endgame loot. People in the past often criticized our design as raid or die, because if you weren't raiding, you just didn't have access to anything remotely good. And within those raids, relatively fewer items dropped, and those items could be tremendously powerful, tremendously impactful upon your performance, whether it's a single trinket that makes you 10% better, and your raid might clear a zone for 3 months, 4 months, and only ever see one for the 4 people in the group who wanted it. That's why things like DKP systems were so common, because loot was scarce.
Yeah.
And when you knew based on randomness that you were likely not to get enough of what you wanted systems to allocate those items efficiently and fairly. Nowadays, it's much easier to get a full set of epic items of a given quality level. You can get eye level 900, 915 items from many sources, and with a variety of stat combinations. We have systems like bonus rolls in place, or even if there's a specific trinket that you really want, you have more opportunity to get that trinket. So in that regard, the impact of randomness has been lessened. But we do want to preserve some sense of a chase, some sense of reward that remains. And not in a manipulative way. If you're not having fun doing content anymore, if you're sick of it, you should take a break. And we're not trying to force you to go back and do things over and over again. In fact, when I hear about people going back and doing old raid content solely in pursuit of legendaries and for no other reason, that clearly feels like a serious defect in our system, and something that we discussed and are actually looking for ways to improve and disincentivize, because that's not good. But we don't want a situation where you're doing content that you're still enjoying, that feels relevant to you, but there's no hope of a reward.
Right.
At the end of the day, we all play games for different reasons. We all play MMORPGs for different reasons. There are social aspects, there's adventure, exploration, challenge, but some of it is also progression, the feeling of getting stronger. That's just the quintessential point of an RPG, and seeing your numbers go up. And it's a bit less exciting when you're killing a boss on farm as you're re-clearing to whatever boss you're stuck on deeper in a zone, and you know that there is zero chance that anything good could happen, that anything could drop from that boss that would be relevant to you. That was the genesis of what was back then the Thunderforge system in Isle of Thunder and Mist of Pandaria. Was trying to, have that variability there, have those longer term chase goals where it's not about do you have the amazing trinket or not, but it's do you have the amazing trinket or a slightly better version of it? And the gap there between the lucky and the unlucky player is much, much smaller. So I guess that's sort of what I mean when I say that there are random events that are more present but less impactful. Having something versus not having it is a very different story than having it versus having a 5% better version of it that is going to give you a trivial increase to your DPS, but still feels pretty good when you get it because you got an upgrade. And it's easy to fixate, and some of this is just human psychology, right? You see that one person with the ridiculous Titan Forge Raid Finder trinket, and the game feels incredibly broken because it's like, oh my god, how could this person who got super lucky get this item that's more powerful than anything I have? But that player, if they're just doing Raid Finder, they have one really powerful item. The rest of their gear is far inferior to yours as, let's say, a heroic mythic raider, and you're going to be lucky in other areas. That's how it averages out in the long run. The areas where we have the most regret when it comes to randomness are the places where that randomness has had too much impact on your power, on outcomes. I think legendaries are probably the biggest one there. And that's a system where if we could go back in time, if you could turn the clock back a year and a half ago, no, we probably are not going to make a system that has, on the one hand, something that's an 8% DPS increase, and on the other hand, in the exact same system, the exact same pool of results, something that's a 0% DPS increase, but gives you a cool utility effect. Because that's not going to feel like a good choice. It's not going to feel like a good outcome. But we can't just throw that entire system out once it's in players' hands. We can't just have you log in one day and your Pyroblast bracers don't do Pyroblast anymore. They're now a pure utility thing that gives you, it's Pride As on your wrist. That would feel, I think, more of a betrayal and more broken. So
welcome to the new patch. We deleted your hat.
Yeah, what we've done is try to narrow that gap. And I think we're more satisfied than we were 10 months ago, but it's not perfect. We're not saying it's perfect. So, we're seeing, as you saw recently in Mythic Dungeon Invitational, legendaries like Pride As and Agrimar Stride actually have a lot of value to them. There's coolness there. And by putting some extra stats on them, they're also a bit more powerful. So we've done work to remedy that problem, but especially early on in the expansion, I think that's a clear example of randomness misapplied, where it was the difference between feeling successful and feeling not. Now, that said, the random distribution of legendaries I don't think is the problem. I think there's something actually, if you imagine a system of more pure utility legendaries, there's something cool about not just having the ability to choose off a list and say, I want this one, everyone decides maybe this is the best one.
Yeah.
But people having somewhat different capabilities of, I'm going to shine in this situation, you're going to shine in that situation, and we'll each feel cool and special when that comes, as long as we don't feel useless in the opposite person's niche. And that's where large power gaps really undermine that system.
Yeah, I can remember even early on in Legion, there were situations where when we were raiding Emerald Nightmare at the time, and we had a healer who got a Pride As and was very upset at the time because at the time Pride As didn't have the extra stats on it, and it was literally just the extra shield every so often. But there were a couple fights in Emerald Nightmare where having that extra absorb was actually amazing. It meant that he was able to just stand back and heal other people and worry about himself a little bit less. And as a result, we just immediately noticed a clear trend. Okay, wherever we put that healer on this fight, everyone over there is just fine. So I do like that sort of aspect of it for sure.
Yeah, I think I remember, again, back before a lot of the buffs to legendaries doing Gul'dan progression on Mythic, and a lot of people used rogues to soak the souls in the middle well, but other classes with different legendaries, if you didn't have a lot of rogues, could do a great job at it. You take a male-wearing class, you put Roots of Saladrasil on them and a Pride As, and they're pretty much self-sufficient in a way that almost no one else could be, and that felt kind of cool. Cool enough to outweigh not having that 8% throughput increase? Probably not.
Sure.
But therein lies the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I still remember when the Mage Tower came up and I was playing Arcane Mage, and I was all of a sudden like, I really wish I had Pride As and Beliviers. That's what I need right now. It was really funny. Anyway, moving on. Next question from Sasham9 on Twitter asking, is there going to be a catch-up mechanic regarding the Netherlight Crucible for alts?
I think
Like,
there already
isn't
is
that-
one.
yeah.
It's the Netherlight Crucible is an account-wide unlock, so that's inherently sort of catch-up there. Then the rest of it just depends on your artifact power, and artifact knowledge as a global value is that in abundance. So a couple months from now, a brand new character, an alt with knowledge 55, will trivially, just doing a few world quests, be able to unlock the second tier of all their relics, and then getting that third tier won't be too far behind. So I think that's really the function that knowledge serves and has served throughout the expansion.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always interesting to me when I see questions like this, largely because I'm someone who plays a lot of alts, and I'm not doing any hardcore Mythic rating or anything like that at the moment. I mostly do Mythic Plus, and so when I see a question like this, I'm like, have you tried it? Is what I always want to ask the person, because for me, getting a new alt to max level right now is actually insanely fun because there's so much that you can go and do right away, and you're immediately just like building out your artifacts all the way like to max right away. Obviously not like maxing out concordance or anything, but you know what I mean. Yeah. So it's actually I think it's really, really cool, and I would highly recommend, like, if you're someone who's been thinking about trying an alt. Sure, it's going to be a problem if you're wanting to make them Mythic raid ready, and I totally understand why it doesn't work in that situation. But if you just want to play a Demon Hunter or you just want to play a Rogue, then go for it. It's actually great at the moment.
Yeah, and if you want to make the Mythic raid ready, hopefully you have a guild that's at least doing heroic that will let them tag along. I mean, that's how catch-up and alt and main switching has worked really throughout the game. It's always been gear-based. We've always had catch-up mechanisms that got you within striking distance of the latest raid content in terms of your item level, but if you wanted to get to the very highest tiers, that was going to take a bit more time. As we've added other progression systems like artifact power or legendaries, we've had to add and develop separate catch-up mechanisms to parallel the core gear ones that we've always had in place.
Cool. Next question here from Zezzy James on Twitter asking, any new information about connecting servers? Some small realms are really struggling again.
Yes. We know that World of Warcraft is a lot more fun when you have a lot of people to play with, when you're on a populous server with a thriving economy. And over time, players have tended to gravitate towards populous servers with character transfers and otherwise, which have left some realms struggling. Now, I think the last time we talked about this, we mentioned that there was a lot of infrastructure work to do to rebuild and re-enable our server connection tech. That was designed in a very different era of the game when our servers worked in a different way than they do now, than they have since Legion, with all the changes we made for sharding and scaling to support a better launch and a smoother experience for Legion. The good news is that work is largely done. We actually recently connected a couple of Brazilian servers, solving some problems there, but also helping test this tech. Ran into some issues, fixed those issues, and the next step for us is to seriously discuss which realms are the best candidates for connection and begin actually formulating a plan to do it. So we hear you. Very sorry it's taken this long, but work is underway.
Awesome. Good to hear. Next question from Mings, who asked, any updates on helping off-spec weapons become as powerful as main spec weapons, since AP has been restricted to a single spec?
I think, again, honestly, the answer there is knowledge. The way knowledge works, math-wise, even if taking it to an extreme example, if you're evenly splitting your AP between two weapons, you'll probably be 3 artifact levels behind where you would have been if you put all of that AP into one weapon. So it's like you could have 1 level 71 weapon or 2 level 68 weapons.
Right.
And the reality is the power gap there is not that large at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're probably much better off in some ways if you have spec flexibility, the ability to bust out 2 level 68 specs that are perfectly suited to a given situation versus literally having one more minor trait point on your main spec, which is, we're talking like a 1% increase there. So I think we're pretty satisfied, honestly, with how knowledge has played out there. And in the long run, as knowledge continues to grow towards 55, as people hit that magical level 75 number on their main spec weapons, anyone who has any hesitation about taking anything away from that main spec for off specs should feel much more free to go back and quickly get those off spec weapons up to level.
Cool. Question here from Heavy Hunter, who asked, do you use any external resources like Warcraft logs and Simulation Craft excuse me, when it comes to class tuning, or do you depend on your own internal, or do you more depend on your own internal data?
Yes, we do, and both, I think, is the answer. It's a combination of the two. It's certainly logs, probably more so than simulation craft, since that is objective, real data that has happened on the servers, versus a complex simulation that often is quite accurate, but may have bugs or quirks or assumptions that are very hard for us to ferret out and understand. But we always compare that against our internal models, our internal data, looking for discrepancies, trying to understand why they're there, if they are there, and using that full picture to determine balance. Now, that said, in a lot of ways, Warcraft logs and simulation craft are more important than our own internal data. Because if those sources are painting a picture of imbalance, but internally our numbers are equal, well, as far as players are concerned, the game's imbalanced. Does us no good, does no one any good for us to say, hey guys, but our internal data, trust us.
No, you're fine, believe us.
And if it ever sounds like we're saying that, I apologize, because it's more we're trying to understand the differences rather than just making blind changes based on a difference that we haven't fully understood, because that's always scary. But at the end of the day, the reason, like, why does balance matter anyway, right? I think the answer to that is because of the subjective perception and how it impacts a player playing the game. If you're playing a single-player game in a vacuum, you don't need to know necessarily whether you're strong or weak. All you care about is, can I finish the content, whatever I'm doing? Do I feel reasonably effective doing this? And that's how most people play most single-player RPGs. You're not necessarily theory crafting every aspect of every build and gear choice, right? You don't play The Witcher and get a new item and then like run a simulation to decide whether you should equip it, because you don't need to. In WoW, where that manifests itself is sort of in social settings. If the community thinks your spec is weak and you try to apply to groups and you get declined, well, then it doesn't matter if actually theoretically your spec has the potential to be strong. The community thinks your spec is weak and that's negatively impacting your gameplay experience. Or if you're going up and looking at a guide for how to play your class effectively, and the first sentence of that paragraph is like, this spec is currently underperforming and you'd be well advised to consider a different spec if you care about maximizing your throughput, well, that's disheartening. That makes you feel like you're doing it wrong. So, I mean, really, our goal in all of this is actually to, as much as possible, try to get to a point where the community perception of balance is a sound one, and our own data matters less in that regard. The other, maybe more long-term approach is, how can we shift the conversation a little bit? How can we shift the design of our game so that balance isn't just a matter of which bar is the longest?
Right.
And this isn't necessarily a great example, but let's say rogues were in the lower half of performing melee specs in Tomb of Sargeras. You still would have seen a lot of rogues brought to cutting-edge raid encounters because of their resilience and their ability to handle certain mechanics that, yes, may have been overdone and involved overused soaking. You still would have seen rogues despite that. And so does damage have to be the be-all and end-all? Or is there a world where clearly you need to bring damage to the table on some level, but there isn't always the question of who's best and who's worst as the sole determining factor of who's good and who's bad? Because the reality is, as tightly tuned as things are, as close together as those Warcraft logs bars are, or Simcraft bars are, there's always going to be somebody at the top of the list, always going to be somebody at the bottom of the list, and there's no path to success or a world where everybody is happy if that's the only metric for are you good or not.
I mean, we don't say, oh, the healer's DPS is super low, so don't bring healers, right? So there's already that very clear element of, we're bringing this person for something that isn't related to this specific bar.
Or
utility can be another way to do that.
Or situationally, if, whether you bring a Holy Paladin or Disc Priest, some healers have the ability for more damage throughput than others. And in situations where you need that extra damage, that can be a reason to bring a certain healer class over one that might have higher theoretical HPS. And in fact, healing and tanking is actually one of the places where class balance, I think, works better overall because it's so much more organic. It's more about the tools that you bring. Sometimes having, the stronger focused single target healing from a Holy Paladin is what matters. Sometimes you want that extra blessing of protection to handle specific mechanics. Other times you really want, Disc Priest damage and some of their other defensive tools. And it's not just a mathy answer. It's not just the question of, well, this is the highest HPS healer, bring 5 of them, because which has borne itself out by and large with the amount of diversity that we've seen there. We would love to somehow get damage dealers to that same place, though that's obviously a challenge in a world where, well, DPS is everything. But does it have to be?
Yeah. It's interesting stuff to think about. Only got a few minutes left, so we'll try to get through as many more questions as we have. Or as many more questions as we can. It's going to depend on if I can actually say that sentence. Next question comes from, I believe it's pronounced Zweilfel. I apologize, mein Deutsch ist nicht so gut. I know the terrain in Argus is not yet ready-made for flying. Any chance to see flying possible in 7.3.x?
Not in Argus, sorry. And it's a product of the environment in Argus and how we built it, of showing you 3 largely disconnected, shattered pieces of a planet, and there's some amount of artistic trickery involved in creating the illusion of a larger planet. Those are utterly incompatible with flying. This was a choice between creating that immersive, epic backdrop and landscape and allowing flying. We opted for the former here, also resting on, I think, the long tradition of, even in expansions that have allowed flying everywhere else, we've had zones like Isle of Thunder, Timeless Isle, and Molten Front, and so forth, where you couldn't. I also want to be clear, like, this isn't necessarily setting the precedent of all future zones are going to be like this either. Broken Shore was a post-release zone, and flying was available there, but given the way Argus is built, there's just no way that it's happening. Sorry.
Okay. Good to at least get a definitive answer on that. Question from Asseter, I think, who said, how do you feel about active mitigation currently, especially in light of the 100% uptime some tanking classes can achieve, like Guardian, while other tanks like Protection Paladins cannot achieve anywhere near that uptime?
So, two issues there. First, so when we're doing encounter mechanics that require active mitigation, that can lead to pretty large skill discrepancies between, like, what do you have to do to always react to this mechanic. That's definitely a problem. The other case where it's a problem is the lower your active mitigation uptime and the more impactful your active mitigation, again, the more susceptible you are to bursts in damage, and the more skill dependent in a bad way tanking can be. There's obviously a lot of nuance. Playing a tank effectively is one of the most challenging roles in the game. Sitting there and tanking patchwork, maybe not so much, but most tanking actually involves sort of being the marshal of battle and positioning and facing and moving around and making sure that the boss is close enough to the adds that the melee can damage both at the same time, and making sure that the melee aren't forced to stand in bad things to do that, etc., etc., etc. That's where we'd like the main challenge and nuance of tanking to lie, not in optimally using your active mitigation in order to not splatter. And for some classes that are more kind of consistently baseline resilient, that tends to feel better than the sense that if you're not timing that Shield of the Righteous perfectly, you're going to explode, and wondering why other tanks don't have to deal with that. So evening that out on that side of things, tank survivability, the difference between active mid uptime and when it's not active in terms of how resilient you are, all of those things, those are active discussions and places we're looking to improve tanking as a role.
Cool. Let's move on. Next question comes from Livy, who asked, is there anything from the Great Legion pruning that you regret removing and may want to bring back in some form?
Some things, yeah. I think mostly in the space of utility. I mentioned Shroud of Concealment earlier.
Yeah.
That's something that we gave back to rogues in 7.1, and it's a good example of the sort of ability that I don't know that it's really cluttering anyone's action bars or their mind space when you're out in the field, when you're soloing. You're not like thinking, wait, should I eviscerate or Shroud of Concealment right now? That's just not how anyone's mind works. And there may have been a little bit of too much of a fixation on ability count versus contention for keybinds for active decision making in the moment. And some of those more abstract utility abilities, I think, added a lot of flavor, added a lot of value and class differentiation. And Shroud came back. There are a number of others that we're looking at. I don't want to get into specific examples right now, lest anything be construed as a promise, or anyone
Sure.
that I omit feel left out. But utility specifically is the place we'd like to start rolling that back a little bit.
Awesome. I think a lot of people will be glad to hear that. I got time for one or two more. Here's a question from Elydia, who asked, can Prestige or Cumulative Honor be account-wide? Sucks I can't PvP on an alt, as it hinders my main's growth appearance-wise.
So, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. I think currently the rationale, the question always comes up of what should be account-wide versus what should be character-specific. And the idea, in PvP especially, we've tended to lean towards more character-specific things. You know, we've done this with visual appearances, with titles in the past, because having those things on a given character reflects your PvP experience and skill with that character. When you see someone who is a Prestige 18 mage, you know they've done a ton of PvP this expansion as a mage. If their warrior who just hit max level and has never been into a battleground before in their life also has Prestige 18 because it's account wide, that starts to water down the meaning of that prestige. Frankly. That said, and then I totally get the feeling though, right? That's part of the tension between mains and alts everywhere. By that logic, why do anything on an alt ever when you could be doing something more in your main? You could be trying to get your item level a bit higher. You could be working on some extra achievement. You could be doing some sort of content, getting more artifact power, whatever. And those are the choices that we all make. You know, do you want that extra little bit of progression on your main, or do you want a fresh experience and more rapid progression on your alt because they're farther along the curve? That's up to you. I guess I'd like to dig into it more. You know, if you feel like we're adding too many prestige levels, if you feel like they're always out of reach on your main, you can never get to a point where you're done or where you're satisfied, and thus that balance always errs in favor of the main, that's where it starts to feel like a problem. But maybe there are solutions that we can explore there that aren't just, okay, all your alts automatically have everything that you've earned on your main.
Yeah, it makes sense. All right, well, that's all the time that we have for today. So thanks so much for everybody who sent in questions, and thanks everybody for watching, and thanks Ian for being here.
Great questions as always, and I will see you guys in a few weeks at BlizzCon.
Yes, definitely. We're going to have a lot to talk about at BlizzCon. As a reminder, you can definitely check out the virtual ticket as well. If you're not able to attend BlizzCon in person, there's going to be all sorts of great stuff on the virtual ticket, so keep an eye out for that.
And Muse, yeah.
So there's that. That's exciting. I just found out about that like 3 minutes before we started. That's really, really cool.
So did I.
Excellent. All right, guys. That's going to be it. Thanks again, everybody. We will see you next time.
Take care.